On one of the very last days of the Second World War in Europe, on the 7th of May 1945, the day when the German high-ranking military officials would sign the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich, there was a terrifying and horrific crime committed inside of the Netherlands, which resulted in over 30 people being killed. The surrender of the Nazis came into effect on the 8th of May 1945 at 11:01 p.m, marking the end of the Second World War in Europe. But the crimes which took place inside of Amsterdam's Dam Square was rough, and the perpetrators of the crimes were unhappy and disgusted, and the German soldiers knew that the war was over, but they still shot their machine guns into a large crowd who were celebrating the end of the conflict. As the guns fired, chaos erupted on the streets, and the shooting, shockingly, was never fully investigated. But why is this, and what happened with the execution of the last German mass shooting of World War II? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Nazis invaded the Netherlands on the 10th of May 1940, and 5 days later, following a devastating bombing campaign, the Dutch surrendered. The government and royal family went to London, and the German occupation would remain until the surrender in May 1945. Throughout the course of the war, there was a significant amount of resistance that grew and became more violent, but there were also huge amounts of persecuted people from the Netherlands who were sent to concentration and extermination centres set up by the Nazis. During the war, there was a huge decline in living standards within the Netherlands, and as the war years rolled on, there were more who were sent to extermination camps, but towards the end of the conflict, many people were suffering very heavily. There was an alarming lack of food and also resources, and this led to thousands succumbing to the hunger winter, a famine at the end of 1944. On the 5th of May 1945 at Lunenburg Heath, Bernard Montgomery, the British Field Marshal, accepted the unconditional surrender of the German forces in the Netherlands, in northwest Germany, in Denmark, and on all naval ships. This surrender came just before the end of the war in Europe. There was a lot of relief and happiness inside of the Netherlands, but the western part of the country remained occupied by the Germans for a few days, as the Allied soldiers needed to arrive to disarm their enemies. On the 6th of May, Canadian troops reached Amsterdam, but then on the 7th of May 1945, thousands of people gathered together on the Dam, a central square inside of Amsterdam. They were jubilant and were there to welcome Allied soldiers into the city. After midday, a number of armoured cars of the British 49th Infantry Division, led by Acting Lieutenant Colonel Richard Tate, approached the square to carry out recon. A convoy of German vehicles, who were also carrying out reconnaissance in the square, arrived, and they passed the British near to the dam, but then disappeared. Now remember that the surrender of these soldiers had officially been signed days before, and that a state of war did not exist between the German soldiers and the civilians or the British in that square in Holland, but still something horrible would happen. The British in the Dam Square realised that the situation could be volatile, and they then withdrew from the city and left the disarming of the German forces to the Dutch resistance. The Germans were in the Royal Palace, the main post office and the main money office. However, the celebrations continued on Dam Square, and German soldiers of the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, were inside of the Grand Club, a building at the corner of the square. Nearby, resistance forces arrested 2 German soldiers. One of these refused to surrender, and he fired his weapon, but the German soldiers then appeared from the windows and the balcony and roof of the Grand Club, and they then began to fire their machine guns. A huge panic broke out on Dam Square, and the crowd fled wherever they could go. Some hid behind streetlights and behind cars in the square, and they tried to shelter. After the shots had broken out, the Germans continued to shoot at resistance members who also returned fire. For 2 hours, gunfire was exchanged, and members of the Red Cross and local nurses tried to tend to the wounded, and there had been many fatalities, people being killed by the gunfire. The man who commanded the local resistance managed to convince a German officer to meet with him, and they then came to the agreement to cease their firing. A local account of the shooting claims that local forces had fired a bazooka at the Grand Club or threatened to do so, forcing the Germans to surrender. The Germans then stayed inside of the building until the Canadians took them into custody and then sent them back to Germany. There had also previously been an outbreak of gunfire at the central station, causing the death of 2 Dutch soldiers and some other German soldiers. Now, the devastation in the square was not fully investigated, and it has been identified that at least 32 people died as a result of the shooting, and this figure does not include those German soldiers who were killed in it. The actual number of deaths may be higher, and some newspaper reports from the time claim that between 100 and 120 people were wounded by German bullets or by the stampede. 26 people died immediately inside the square, their bodies being left for some time as the gunfire continued, and 5 more died from the gunshot wounds they sustained, with a final victim dying 6 weeks later from their injuries. It's not known why the German forces began to fire upon the people in the crowd. One Kriegsmarine officer, who was involved in the slaughter, later claimed that the firing began as they wanted to bring an end to the shameful ordeal of the women at the hands of the Dutch resistance, who were being shamed and punished for allegedly sleeping with German soldiers. This German officer claimed, and I quote, "And on this hand-pushed truck, women who had relations with Germans were brought in, under the crowd's hilarity. These women were tried before some kind of tribunal. Their heads were shaved and painted with lead vermilion. All of this did not happen quite gently. Blood poured out of their faces. The women screamed and cried for help. This all happened under the eyes of the Germans. The Germans shouted to leave the women alone, however this did not happen. Meanwhile, resistors circled the palace. Some of them stood at the organ, with loaded rifles or something like that. The commotion and screaming of the women grew heavier. The shots were fired. At first the Germans fired over their heads. The resistors took cover behind the organ and shot at the balcony, diagonally above their heads. Before long the Germans and resistors began shooting at each other, and the Germans' intent went so far that they started firing 1 or more machine guns. Amongst them there were no casualties, as far as known, nor amongst the resistors, but yet amongst the common citizens of Dam, who in deadly fear took cover on the square or ran away, many on bare feet to run faster. There were 22 dead and almost 60 severely wounded, of whom some, their number is unknown, later passed away. It's not known entirely whether this was the exact cause, but it's also suspected that in the area of the square, some de-armament of German forces was being undertaken, and German soldiers were being arrested by the resistance. There is no evidence as to the story of the women on the truck being subjected to the punishment mentioned by the Kriegsmarine officer, but one of the most common beliefs about the crime is that the German soldiers may have wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, executing many people inside of the square as they knew the war was over, and they may have also been heavily intoxicated, drinking heavily inside of the club, which may have been a significant factor. They may have also thought the people in the square were gloating about the Germans losing the war. Frustration over losing the war could have been the driving cause of the shooting in the Dam Square, but it was a horrific execution and massacre that led to 32 people being killed in the final German atrocity of the Second World War in the Netherlands. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.